I really want to thank the Athens Center staff for inviting me back again. This is a real honor and privilege to come here to read from the second volume of Shadow of the Lion. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about walking in Alexander's footsteps. I'm going to kind of read this off here because I wrote this out today so that I wouldn't leave out any of the details of the background of this major project of writing Shadow of the Lion. I've walked in Alexander's footsteps since I was a 16-year-old, and I learned about him in high school history class. He became my hero and my writing muse. I spent my time researching about him in the libraries. During my last year of high school, I wrote an Alexander-themed novel, Rivers of Blood, which was eventually forwarded to a publisher who was impressed by my knowledge and talent, but suggested I put it away for a year or two till I had matured and honed my writing skills further. I never did return to that first novel, but I still have it stored away, and I've often thought it may make a good young adult story. The years passed, I was married, we had children, quit writing for a time, but finally in the 1970s I went back to it and joined a creative writing class at night school. By then I'd been reading all of Mary Renault's books about Greece, in particular her trilogy about Alexander. She became my writing muse, and I was inspired again to write about Alexander. But what could I write that she hadn't already done such a brilliant job on? I decided to write a young adult book about Alexander's little-known son, Alexander IV, who'd been born a month after Alexander died, and to his Sogdian wife, Roxana. I began to research again, and after a year, had the beginning of the novel, but I realized that this story was much too powerful and political to be just a young adult story. So I was advised to begin over. I established a theme, how blind ambition and greed brought down a world power. I expanded it into multiple points of view, giving voices to Alexander's friends, his generals, the women, the Persians who were involved in the court, and his archenemy Cassandros, the vengeful son of the regent Antipater, who is the villain of the story. I returned to Greece many times, including the times I lived here in the 1980s, and with the help of the Greek Consul General in Vancouver, who arranged to fly me back for research in 1993, I began the long task of writing the story. I had help and encouragement from the Greeks, including the Society of Macedonian Studies, classical scholars, and others such as the Finnish Institute. It was a long journey, almost as long as Alexander's had been in his war against the Persians and his long trek across Asia. But finally, 15 years later, Shadow of the Lion was finished. Then came the long process of editing and finding a publisher. Eventually, a British publisher, Media Aria CDM in Bristol, accepted it and because the publisher, it turned out, was a huge fan of Alexander. However, because the manuscript was very long, he suggested dividing it into two parts. Volume 1, Shadow of the Lion, Blood on the Moon, was published in 2014 at a highly successful launch sponsored by the Greek Consulate of Vancouver. That's the book that I read here the last time I was here. This first volume begins with Alexander's death in Babylon in 323 BC, followed by the birth of his son a month later. His death incites quarrels between the generals over who will take charge and follows the journey of the two joint kings, the infant Alexander IV, and Alexander's mentally challenged half-brother Philip Aridaeus, across Asia to Macedon. There are many conflicts along the way, especially when Ptolemy hijacks the funeral carriage and they must pursue it to Egypt. Eventually they arrive across the Hellespont to Thrace and begin their final journey to Macedon. By this time, the boy, known by his Persian name Iskander, is 5 years old and beginning to understand what it means to be a royal boy. His mother is overprotective of him. He has a Persian court advisor, Nabazanes, who's like a father figure. and his best friend is an elephant, Old Pearl, and her mahout, Sadu. Eventually, they arrive at Macedon, only to learn that the aging regent is on his deathbed, and his vindictive son, Cassandros, has committed a violent crime. It is into this scene of uncertainty that Volume 1 ends. Volume 2, Shadow of the Lion, The Fields of Hades, was published in December 2016, and it recounts the conflicts and battles between the successors who each want to claim a share of Alexander's empire. It also tells of the conflicts between the women, Roxana, his widow, Olympias, his fierce and unrelenting mother, his sister Cleopatra, and half-sister Thessaloniki, as well as the warrior princess Adea Eurydice, wife of Philip Aridaeus. During this time, the boy Iskander has grown old enough to understand the gravity of his role. But what will happen to him, and how will this conflict end? I'm going to read first the prologue and epilogue from Shadow of the Lion, Blood on the Moon. The prologues and epilogues of both books are in the point of view of Ptolemy, Alexander's illegitimate half-brother, who could have claimed control of the army, but chose instead to go to Egypt to build the city of Alexandria. So he's in and out of the novel all the way through, and he's one of the more sympathetic characters in the story. So I'm going to start with the prologue from Book 1 and the epilogue from Book 1, and then I will continue with readings from The Fields of Hades. Prologue. I perish great, and in a mighty deed I shall expire. Let future ages hear it and admire Hector before he dies in the Iliad. Babylon, the 20th day of the moon of Panamos, June, 323 BC. In the old palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Ptolemy Lagos sat at his writing desk. A page of parchment lay open before him. His hand trembled as he picked up the stylus and began to write. Anonymous darkness has fallen over the streets of Babylon. Men are straying through the city, not daring to kindle a light. The great Alexander, my brother and friend, is dead. He, who shone among us like the sun, has robbed us of our light, and his immortal soul ascends to a home among the stars. His death brings my heart such grief, it dies within me. He set down the pen and wiped the sweat from his brow. Any other time, he'd have called a slave to fan him, but this day he needed to be alone. Outside in the corridor, there were hushed noises, soft footsteps, furtive whispers. Even from afar, he could hear the wild keening in the streets of the city. He felt crushed with fatigue. He'd been up all night watching by the king's bedside. Slowly, he collected his thoughts and dipped the stylus into the ink. He scanned the page into his writing board. He must record every detail. Alexander was ill for 10 days. On the 18th day of Panamos, he attended a banquet, and after drinking a cup of unmixed wine, he fell ill with a fever. That night, he slept in the bathing room, and the following day, after his bath, he moved to his bedchamber. The next morning, he had us move his bed to the side of the bathing pool. On the 7th day, his fever was so violent he had to be carried to his sacrifices. The fever did not abate, and he could no longer speak. The soldiers began to riot because they believed he was already dead. So we allowed them into his bedchamber, and they filed by his beds, weeping. Python and Seleucus went to the temple of Serapis to inquire whether they should bring Alexander there. The god answered that they should leave him where he was. When I looked at him, he seemed to be at peace at last. There was in his eyes a look of calm acceptance. I have wept for him. He was both a god and a man. He will continue to live, I think, forever and ever. His achievements will live long in the memory for thousands and thousands of years. Ptolemy ran his hand through his short cropped hair and heaved a sigh. It was too late for regrets. To think if only Alexander had heeded the omens and not come to Babylon in midsummer. Composing himself, he placed the parchment page back into the carved box on his desk and latched the lid. And now, after the journey of the kings from Babylon to Macedon, this is the epilogue for Book 1, Blood on the Moon. Zeus the Father holds in his balance on his golden scales the fates of those who will live or die. They are poised, a mighty weight. The fields are dyed with the blood of slaughtered heroes. The Iliad. Alexandria, Egypt, summer 319 BC. Ptolemy woke suddenly, startled by a powerful dream. In the dream, someone had called him and he had recognized the voice of Alexander. My friend, we would live forever if we did not face our foes and fight. You cannot escape the battle that lies before you. Prove yourself honorable and good, so that you may obtain the kingdom, not because of me, but because of yourself. He had fallen asleep at his writing table amid the piles of scrolls and papers of his administration. Ptolemy pushed aside the piles of scrolls and got up from the table. He felt stiff and fatigued, and the words from the dream troubled him. The day before had been long as he pored over the building plans, received envoys, read dispatches from abroad. Foreign ambassadors had told him of uprisings in Athens against the Macedonians and unrest in some of the satrapies. It seemed that all of Alexander's empire was fomenting with strife. From the time General Perdiccas had so boldly claimed the royal signet ring and taken control of the army, there had been ongoing confrontations. The men Alexander had trusted were locked in bitter competition over the spoils of wars. Ptolemy went out to the balcony and peered out over the darkened city. A few torches were still alight down in the harbor in the guard stations. A full moon hung above the sea, not the serene face of gentle Selene, but an ominous mask tinged with red. He looked toward Hephaestion's temple, with a sacred flame blazed from a crescent on a tall pole above Alexander's tomb. The words of Alexander in the dream resonated in his thoughts. You cannot escape the battle that lies before you. One dispatch which he had received the previous day, sent from Amphipoli by the garrison commander Aristonus, disturbed him. By the time you get this message, the joint kings, escorted by General Polyperchon, will arrive at Pella. I have learned that the regent is in poor health. The old man is near his 80th year, and I fear he has not long to live. Cassandros has returned to Pella to administer his father's affairs. We know what poisonous deeds Cassandros is capable of. Old friend, I beseech you to offer your support and protection for the well-being of the kings. This news had disconcerted Ptolemy. He was certain that with Cassandros at Pella there would be treachery afoot. He recalled that Antipater had appointed Polyperchon as guardian of the kings until they reached the royal city, but he doubted Polyperchon's capabilities. The man had a reputation of being an opportunist who would be loyal to whoever offered him the most rewards. He reflected with a tinge of regret that he had not accepted the general's offer of leadership after Perdiccas was assassinated. Yet he was living part of Alexander's dream here in the city he had built, according to Alexander's plan. He thought of Alexander's son. On the day of the child's birth, he had vowed to see that little Alexander would be protected. Now with the regent's failing health and that scoundrel Cassandros lurking in his father's shadow, how could this be assured? The child was the last of the Argead dynasty. If anything happened to him, Alexander's Macedon would be no more. The gods hold his destiny. May they look on him and keep him safe until then, Ptolemy thought. What could he do to ensure the child's safety when he was so far away? At best, he could send envoys or spies who would keep him informed. He looked across the rooftops of the city toward the glimmering sea. The moon had waned, and Sirius, the dog star, was visible, gleaming like a copper shield in the pre-dawn sky. Orion's dog, they called it, the star of Isis, an inauspicious omen, one portending pestilence and drought. The wind gusted suddenly, shuddering the fronds of the palms. Was it the wind of impending war he felt? Ptolemy shivered and drew his cloak tighter around his shoulders. Alexander, my brother, I will not let them destroy what you gave your life to preserve. I will give my own life, if I have to see that this is so. 4 years ago, he had stood by Alexander's bedside and seen the life seep out of his body. He had made an oath to defend the empire and sworn his allegiance until the end of time. As he had leaned close to kiss Alexander, he had heard him whisper, I foresee great contests at my funeral games. In truth, Alexander had barely drawn his last breath before there was bloody fighting in the bedchamber, his men behaving like wild beasts quarreling over his corpse. And in the past 4 years since the king's death, betrayal and underhandedness had corrupted the army. Alexander had led them fearless and brave as a lion. Together they had conquered the world. Now his dream of brotherhood was being destroyed. There was a stench of corruption that had not existed while Alexander lived. Men he had trusted had turned his dream into a quest for their own glory. Ptolemy could not let this happen, but how could he stop it? And what would become of the boy, little Alexander, who was meant to inherit his father's throne? When Roxana and the child finally arrived in Pella, who would guarantee their safety? If Antipater died, who would take charge of the kings? Everyone knew that Cassandros had hated Alexander from boyhood. He was ambitious and not to be trusted. His vengeful jealousies and homicidal rages were well known. And as for the old queen Olympias, her mysticism, quarrelsome temper, and reputation for atrocity would surely put Roxana and her child in further danger. And what about the other one, Aridaeus? He felt pity for Alexander's dull-witted half-brother. Neither little Alexander nor Aridaeus were exempt from treachery. Ptolemy turned, hearing the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him. It was Thais, wrapped in a nightrobe, her coppery hair tousled. Ptolemy, I woke to find you were not in the bed beside me. What is it, my love? You look troubled. Is that why you have not slept? He did not speak, but put his arm around her shoulders and drew her close to his side. Thais' fragrance and the warmth of her body next to his always brought him comfort. A soft pink light flooded the eastern sky as the sun rose over the delta. Below the palace, the narrow streets of Alexandria were stirring with activity. Ptolemy glanced toward the Soma and saw a spark of light as the golden laurel wreath over Alexander's tomb caught the rising sun. It had been Alexander's wish to return to the land of Ammon. He had pledged that Alexander's body would be venerated and protected forever. At least he's safe here, far from the turmoil, in a place where he wanted to be, left in peace, Ptolemy thought. Today he would sacrifice a ram at the temple of Ammon. Then, as he did every day, he would go to Alexander's tomb, where he always found solitude and peace. So that's the end of the first book. Just going to grab a drink of water and then continue. This book starts with the Polypersian and the king's entourage just arriving in Pella. Sitting straight on his easy-pacing charger, his face set in a grim mask, Polypersian rode forward a length ahead of the kings and their escort. Behind him, the rhythm of the drums had become a dirge, and ahead he saw, as if a dire omen, a flock of ravens rise out of the trees. He remembered how the ravens had flocked over Babylon before Alexander died. Could these ravens that blackened the sky over Pella be the portents of a coming tempest? He wondered what scene would greet him at the regent's house. Would Cassandros be there, hovering like a vulture over his dying father, his greedy hands ready to seize the reins of power? The sun lay low beyond the western mounts, framing the palace on its Acropolis heights in a red and gold glow. He stared toward the scene in contemplative silence. His roots were in those distant hills. In the air of those mountains he had known childhood happiness. In that palace he had shared wine with the king and watched young Alexander grow to manhood. He longed for those carefree days before he had tasted the bitterness of war, the futility of the endless conquests that had taken him to the outer boundaries of the world. He had seen through 2 generations Macedon grow into a world power. But with Philip and Alexander gone, and Antipater, the linchpin of the regency, on the brink of death, how could the dynasty survive? So much had happened since the day 15 years ago he had ridden out of Pella with Alexander. With only a few years, Alexander had conquered the world, but now as he lay in his golden bier in Egypt, his empire was being torn apart. Asia had been divided between the successors, and nearly all the Greek cities were ready to revolt. Philip may have secured the kingdom, but Alexander had left it unattended. In his absence, Argoside Antipater had dealt firmly with the uprisings, but many things had been done in Greece that Alexander had never sanctioned, and the citizens resented it. And now fresh news from Pella, the Cassandras had murdered the Athenian senators. It did not bode well. It's only a matter of time before the Greeks will rise up again, Polycratian thought. Does Macedon have the strength to fight them? He had long ago lost the taste for war and had hoped for peace. What is to become of us, he wondered. When Antipater dies, who will hold the empire together? As he led the kings into the city, it was as if he was leading them into a dark labyrinth. What monster would be waiting for them there? The child rode beside Aridaeus amid their bodyguards along the wide cobbled avenue that led into Pella, where people stood in expectant clusters. Faint, curious murmurs could be heard among the bystanders. There was cheering, but it was Polypertian the crowd cheered for, a kinsman's welcome, their voices raised in hoarse cries of admiration. Except for these accolades and the little bursts of applause from some youths who had come out of curiosity to see the kings, the crowd stayed silent as the royal entourage passed. When at last Iskander heard his name, Alexander, Alexander, resounding up and down the streets, he did not know their cries were not for him, but for the man they had loved who would never return. It was late afternoon. The sun had lowered behind the mountains. A light ground mist hung over Pella's lake, swirling around the base of the knoll where a palace rose above the slate rooftops. They passed through a maze of narrow streets until they came to a stately mansion which looked as though it belonged to someone of great importance. There they reined in their horses. A chamberlain led them into a fountain court where they were received with a welcome cup of wine and offerings of formal hospitality. The child was used to being in strange places, among people who stared at him as if he had 2 heads, but he held fast to Polypertian's hand. Servants whispered and peeped from doorways and pointed their fingers at him, giggling behind their hands until the chamberlain clapped his and shooed them away. Behind the great oaken doors of the regent's chamber, low voices sounded. Iskander let go of Polypertian's reassuring grip and fell back a few steps, looking up, his head tilted a little. Do I have to go in? Can't I wait here? There was a fish pond. He remembered how he and his nurse Lyra used to sail his little boats. Please sit down, refresh yourselves, the chamberlain said with a gracious flourish of his hand. You must be weary after such a long journey. Aridaeus glanced about edgily and fiddled with the hem of his cloak. How are you, sir? The chamberlain said. Do you remember me? I was your father's chamberlain in the palace up the hill. Father? Aridaeus sent a terrified look over his shoulder as if he expected a ghost to be lurking in the shadows. When you were a boy, I used to play hide and find with you in the gardens. Do you remember? Aridaeus looked confused. The chamberlain put his hand on Aridaeus' arm and gave it a gentle squeeze. Never mind, sir. That was a long time ago. The chamberlain ordered a slave to have chairs brought out, and another to fetch a tray of citrus drinks and sweet cakes, which were set on a little marble table under the shade of the rose arbor. Iskander sat on a chair beside Aridaeus and waited patiently while the servant poured the drinks into small clay cups. He felt scared in this strange house, separated from his mother and all else that was familiar to him. He understood the reasons why they had come here. The regent was dying, just as the Magus had died. He bit sparely into his cake. He had learned living with soldiers all his life, what to do when there was a tragedy unfolding. He willed that all would be well now, that soon Polypersian would take him to the palace, so he would be reunited with his mother and Navarzanes, and life would be good again. More men had begun crowding into the courtyard, arriving in twos and threes, bearded warriors in tall plumed helmets and sleekly oiled leather cuirasses, and land barons wearing their finest loom-woven cloths and all their dazzling gold. The sound of their voices grew louder and deeper. They all trooped through and gathered in front of the door of the regent's chambers, exchanging news. Then the great door opened, and the knot of men gave way to allow Polypersian to enter the regent's chamber. Gravely, Polypersian entered the regent's bedchamber. The room was pungent with fragrance of boiling herbs and smoke from the oil and braziers, and the small fire kindled in the hearth. The physician motioned for Polypersian to come near. He looked down at Antipater's shrewd, aged face, now tinged with the color of tallow. Here was the wise, weathered old warrior, the one who had led Philip's army and guarded the kingdom for Alexander. He and Antipater had shared the northern winters, rode together through Illyrian battle rushes in the mountain passes, drank water out of muddy trenches, and shared wine at victory banquets. Now he lay gasping for his last breath, a dry, cracked shell of his former self. Polypersian, at last you have come. The mighty voice that had called the assembly to order and rung across countless battlefields with the victory pan was now barely audible, weak as the bleating of a newborn lamb. Your boy met me in the field just east of Pella, Polypersian said. He said your physician sent him. I trust you would be here on time. Of all those I am closest to, I knew I could depend on you. The old man's breath rattled when he spoke. His feeble hands clasped the bed sheets. My sons Cassandros, Nicanor, poor mad Alexarchos. He struggled to catch his breath. I cannot depend on them except for mischief. Polypersian cleared his throat to fill the pause. Your boy told me the news, the Athenians. Antipater rose up on the bed as if filled with new strength. Demades and his son, both slaughtered, accused of treason without even a trial. Treason? Cassandros murdered them. His eyes glittered. When I sent him to Babylon, he murdered Alexander. He killed Iolaus too, his own brother. You know, a dead dog doesn't bark. His own brother, he killed him. Tears rolled down his seamed cheeks. Polypersian shook his head. Surely this was the raving of one who is demented. Antipater had always been a kingly man, an aristocrat, and an exemplar of manhood. Polypersian had always thought of him as an eagle among crows. Nobody could compare with Antipater. It grieved him to see his old friend like this, his brilliant mind wandering and his body now so frail. Antipater, you can't be certain, Polypersian said. You know how stories increase in their telling. I was at Babylon when Alexander died. Nothing was proven. Nevertheless, I failed him. Polypersian shook his head and sighed. Your son? Nonsense. No, Alexander, I failed him when I sent Cassandros to Babylon. You were always Alexander's most faithful friend, Antipater. You have served the royalty many years. What would Philip have done without you at his right hand? Antipater began to ramble again. Philip, now there was a man. I was there. I failed him too. That awful day. Tears ran down the furrows of his cheeks. We were all at Aggie the day that Philip died. Philip wanted to go to the theater alone. He wouldn't even let Alexander ride in with him. Antipater cursed. She had a hand in it, the epirote, Olympias. Sweat glistened on his brow. He and Olympias had been enemies for years, and the mere mention of her obviously agitated him. No one has proven her guilty. Just as no one has proven Cassandra's guilt, yet I'm certain he killed Alexander, and Iulus too, and I know that witch had a hand in Philip's assassination. He groped and found Polyperchon's hand. His fingers were icy, but he still had strength enough to squeeze it. Don't let that woman meddle in things. She wrote Alexander letters, blatant lies about me, tried to turn him against me. Olympias was always jealous of you, Antipater. She never forgave Alexander for giving you all the authority. She supposed he would let her rule here in his absence. Now the regency is yours, Polyperchon. What about Cassandros? He'll expect it. By law, he should inherit the title. Antipater raised himself up and shook his finger. My son, that braggart, a wastrel, he's a treacherous man with no scruples. He sucked in a deep, rattling breath. Cassandros has no talent for war. He's a conniver and he intrigues as handily as anyone. Don't trust him, Polyperchon. He sank back against the pillows and closed his eyes. Turning his head to one side, he heaved a sigh. Cassandros a thorn in my side since he was a child. I considered disinheriting him, but Nicanor pleaded on his brother's behalf. He coughed a little and caught his breath. An error in judgment that I relented. He struggled to sit up again, his eyes wide, scanning the room. I'll not relent now. Cassandros means to seize the power for himself. To think that what he did, murdering the Athenians, killing his own brother and Alexander. Polyperchon leaned closer to speak in a confidential whisper. Antipater, what is the present state of the Greek cities now that Cassandros has committed this treachery? Antipater clutched at his arm. I expect they will rise up. Polyperchon, you must prevent it. Do what you must. Do not allow them to revolt. Polyperchon wanted to say, I'm not the one to pacify them. He had no wish to wade into that tumult of confusions and certain disaster, but he did not have the heart to deny him this one last request. Antipater peered around the room, his eyes searching the shadows. The kings, are they here? You must guard them, protect them. The kings are both waiting in the courtyard, Antipater. I brought them here. I knew you would want to see them. Alexander's son, is he here? Yes, little Alexander, and Aridaeus too. Antipater fell back on his pillows. Aridaeus, that pitiable fool, to name him as a joint king, it was merely a political expediency. Perdiccas and the others, they wanted the power. They went against my wishes. He reached out and seized Polyperchon's arm, motioning for him to bend closer so he could whisper into his ear, you must secure the kingdom for Alexander's son. From his knotted hand, Antipater drew the massive ring of antique goldwork, the ring that was the royal seal of Macedon. Your honor is unquestioned. Only one man can take my place, Polyperchon. That is you. Will you lead the Macedonians? I have loved them as a father loves his own children. Now I entrust them to your care. That's as much as I'll read of that particular chapter. Now, this scene is with the little boy when Polyperchon takes him to Alexander, the room that